with Highway 146 at a very special edition. We repeat.
This formerly free TV channel has been confiscated by the federal government, so a wireless monopoly can begin sending you another monthly bill.
Okay, school's back in session. The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will now come to order, and the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And I do want to begin by welcoming everyone to the Communications and Technology Subcommittee with our hearing titled The Broadcast Incentive Auction, Update on Repacking Opportunities and Challenges. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. We appreciate having your perspective on this issue. Mobile connectivity has become an essential component of our everyday lives. Today, Americans are consuming more mobile content than ever before. Since 2010, data traffic delivered over wireless networks has increased by a factor of 35. Last year alone, Americans generated over 13 trillion megabytes of wireless data traffic. That is the equivalent of 1.5 million years of streaming HD video. Now that is what is running over our networks. All of this consumption has led to a pressing need for more mobile broadband spectrum. This committee, along with the FCC, NTIA, and the private sector, has worked to identify opportunities to feed the spectrum pipeline. The broadcast incentive auction presented a rare opportunity to make a significant block of spectrum available for mobile broadband use. After years of discussion on auction design and preparation, the first 2 phases of the auction have been successfully completed. Earlier this year, the reverse and forward auctions concluded, raising $19.8 billion in revenues, the second largest auction in FCC history, and contributing over $7 billion to federal deficit reduction. We have now begun the 3rd phase of the auction. This is the Repack. In crafting legislation that authorized the auction, this committee worked very hard to strike a balance between the needs of broadcasters and the consumer demand for wireless service. Discussions involving stakeholders from all sides of the auction resulted in agreement on the post-auction transition timeline and budget. The FCC has done its part to carry out the first part of the auction and set the parameters for the Repack. It is now time for industry to work together to ensure that this agreement is honored and that the Repack is completed on time. This morning, we will hear about the ongoing challenges with completing this phase of the auction. Our witnesses will discuss outstanding issues with relocating broadcasters to new channels, as well as the importance of clearing the 600 megahertz band as soon as possible. We will also examine unanswered questions surrounding low-power television and translator stations, an issue that is very important to many members on this committee. Hurricane Harvey has reminded each and every one of us, and now Hurricane Irma, which is pressing down on the U.S. We all know how important broadcasters and wireless providers are in times of emergency. Preserving access to over-the-air television while also meeting consumer needs for mobile broadband is a goal that we all share and a problem we need to all resolve together. Today's panel will inform us on the challenges and the opportunities of the latest effort to advance this goal. And at this time, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate our witnesses who are here today for this really important hearing. The legislation that brings us here today started back in 2012 with the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act under the FCC. Our whole goal then was to take this very important spectrum and make it available for its highest and best purpose and use, and drive innovation and help try to find a spectrum that would meet the insatiable demand of all of us who are consumers, who pull up all of our devices, like many of you probably are wishing you were doing right now, instead of listening to me, and watch video, among other things. And so it's important that we did that. We raised $19.8 billion to the government. We funded FirstNet, or at least the first tranche of FirstNet, for the interoperable public safety broadband network called for by the 9/11 Commission, and we're continuing our oversight over that. But today, we need to look at this repack. That's the next phase. I said all along we would do that at the appropriate time to see if the right amount of funds are there to accomplish the goal. We didn't know. We still don't know for sure. We're also concerned about the timelines, the number literally of engineers that can do repacks. We've heard about FM stations that may be affected that we didn't know, really think through that they may have an effect here. And so we've got a lot of work on our hands. We know that. We want to hear from each of you. That's why it's such a diverse panel, because we know how much is at stake. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for working with us over the last 5 years. And now we enter the final phase. We want to make sure we get this phase right as well. So, Madam Chair, I thank you for your leadership on this issue and that of the committee on both sides of the aisle. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Gentleman yields. So this concludes the member opening statements. I would like to remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, their statements will be made a part of the record. We want to thank, pardon me, our witnesses for being here today and for taking the time to come before the subcommittee. And you are each going to have the opportunity to deliver your opening statement. You'll be followed with a round of questions by members. We look forward to your answers. And our witness panel today includes, and we are welcoming Scott Bergman, who is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA. Welcome back. Rebecca Murphy-Thompson, who is the General Counsel and Executive VP of the Competitive Carriers Association. Rick Kaplan, who is the General Counsel and Executive VP of the National Association of Broadcasters. Patrick Butler, who is the CEO of America's Public Television Stations Go Vols. Lynn Platinga, who is the VP and General Manager of News Channel 5 Network in Nashville, Tennessee. And she does not say Go Vols, she says Go Vandy. And, pardon me, Jim Tracy, who is the Chairman of the National Association of Tower Erectors. Lady yields back. Mr. Kaplan, 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Members Pallone and Doyle, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Rick Kaplan, and I am the General Counsel of the National Association of Broadcasters. On behalf of NAB, I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the unprecedented repacking of nearly 1,000 TV stations as part of the Broadcast TV Incentive Auction. NAB has worked closely with this subcommittee on the legislation authorizing the incentive auction and its subsequent implementation. One of the fundamental elements underpinning our collaboration has been Congress's commitment that broadcasters and their viewers would be held harmless following the auction. In practice, this means that non-participating broadcasters would remain on the air, serve the same viewers after the auction as they did before, and not be required to incur costs when being assigned new frequencies. It is also important that Congress take meaningful steps to protect those broadcasters who had no stake in the auction, but are now its likely collateral damage. Hundreds of FM radio stations that are co-located with Repack TV stations may be saddled with new costs and significant disruptions. Low-power TV and translators are also struggling to maintain their ability to serve urban and rural audiences. NAB continues to believe that with congressional and FCC leadership, the Repack can be a success. To date, Chairman Pai has more than ably guided the Commission through a repacking process that received little attention before he assumed the agency's helm. We are grateful to bipartisan congressional leaders for their attention to this issue and to Ranking Member Pallone and his co-sponsors for the proposed legislative solution. We look forward to continuing to work with you to help this transition proceed as smoothly as possible for all stakeholders, and most critically, the viewers and listeners who rely on our signals every day. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss these issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Butler, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Microphone, please.
Got it. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Madam Chairman. As the representative of 170 public television licensees throughout America, let me focus my testimony today on the need for more funds to complete the repacking of our channels in the aftermath of the Spectrum auction. That need is real, and for public television stations in particular, those funds are essential to our continued service. Thanks to the advocacy of this subcommittee, Congress approved a $1.75 billion post-auction transition fund in the original Spectrum law. The FCC has now determined that broadcasters will need at least another $400 million to be held harmless from the financial effects of this transition, as the law requires. For the 149 public television stations being repacked, the funding deficiency is more than $50 million. This is in addition to the roughly $270 million which repacking public stations are scheduled to receive from the original transition fund. These are all staggering, overwhelming figures for public television stations operating as local, nonprofit educational institutions, and we must rely on the good faith of the Congress to hold us harmless in this transition as promised. Kentucky Educational Television alone must reconfigure 16 transmitters to accommodate the post-auction repacking requirements. KET, a state agency, needs $21 million to comply with this mandate of the federal government, roughly the equivalent of a full year's operating budget. Other public television stations, whether licensed to states, universities, local school districts, or nonprofit community foundations, are all in the same boat. Without your help, that boat will capsize, and with it will go the essential services in education, public safety, and civic leadership on which your constituents depend. America's public television stations supported the Spectrum auction process from the beginning, and we are committed to completing this repacking transition as soon as possible. But none of this should suggest that we are capable of bearing an additional $50 million repacking burden on our own. Incurring such an extraordinary expense would devastate the very programs and services that make public television so valued by so many millions of Americans across the country and across the political spectrum. For 54% of American families, public television is all the preschool education their kids get. PBS Learning Media helps almost 2 million educators teach 40 million K-12 students with more than 120,000 curriculum-aligned interactive digital learning objects created from the best of public television, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, NASA, and more. In conclusion, the sooner we can get these additional funds, the more likely it is that public television stations can repack on schedule, avoid going dark, and continue the essential services we provide to 97% of the American people. Congress is our only hope, and this subcommittee once again has a critical role to play in assuring that the last act of the auction process is as smooth and successful as the first. Thank you.
Ms. Platinga, 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Blackman, Ranking Members Pallone and Doyle, and members of the subcommittee. To put what is an otherwise academic problem in real terms, News Channel 5's move will require the purchase and installation of a new transmitter, new primary antenna, and an interim antenna. We estimate that these equipment and labor costs will total $4.1 million for our station alone. While this is a high number, it is not atypical. Of Scripps' 33 local television stations, 17 of them will be moving channels, including those in Tampa, Buffalo, and Detroit, at an estimated cost of $55 million. More people tune to News Channel 5 for news and information than to any other station in the state of Tennessee. We've earned this position in the market through dependable coverage, quality journalism, and investing in our team and tools so we can raise the bar every day. Local broadcasters like us who drew the proverbial short straw and faced this channel change upheaval through no fault of their own should certainly not be required to drain additional resources from their coverage by footing the bill from a repack for which we yielded no benefit. In conclusion, I really want a shared goal for a successful transition that accomplishes Congress's objective of deploying additional wireless services. However, 5 asks that Congress take all the necessary steps to ensure that its relocation costs are fully covered by the FCC. Our viewers be protected from any risk of signal disruption should we be unable to complete our station in time, fault of our own. Anything less would not only be inequitable, but would undermine the ability of news channels and all of these impacted broadcasters to continue to serve Nashville and the other local communities. Thank you again for inviting me here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
This concludes our testimony, and so we're going to move into our question and answer part of this hearing, and I'm going to begin by recognizing myself. Time has expired. Mr. Doyle, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This first question is for the whole panel, and I'm just looking for a yes or no answer. Do you think the Broadcaster Relocation Fund is sufficient to relocate the broadcasters? I'll start with Mr. Bergman.
Certainly based on the FCC's initial estimates, it looks like it is.
Microphone.
Microphone, please. And I'm looking for a yes or no.
Sure. I think based on current estimates, it looks like no.
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 That's not my area of expertise.
Okay, so we have, what, 5 no's and an abstention. Let me just say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that we're ready to close this gap. I don't think any of us want broadcasters in our districts to go off the air and people to be cut off because of an accounting error.
Chairman Walden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Butler, I appreciate your testimony and the good work your stations do, and your reminder to the committee that it was our subcommittee that I chaired back when in 2012 that said probably need about $3 billion to do this. And then it ran into our friends in the Senate who wanted $1 billion, and we got it up to $1.75 billion. But my belief then was that wasn't enough, but it was the best we could negotiate with Senator Reid and his people. And now we're, some of us could say, told you so. But we still don't know what the exact number is going to be, and I think it's important we work together as we go through this transition in Repack to make sure that broadcasters are not adversely harmed. Because having played a large role in writing this, the assurance was given, as we were reminded from my broadcast friends, that those innocent parties would not be injured. They would be compensated, and there would be time to work this through. And so we have more work to do here, clearly. In terms of your situation in Tennessee, are you able to get the other equipment when you're ordering new antennas, new transmitters, and all that? Is that, you feel confident that your station there and the others you're involved with, that flow is working in a timely enough manner?
It's a good question. I believe that the time frame that's been laid out from our perspective is achievable if everything goes smooth.
All right. Now,
our experience has been specifically in panel changes. We've not had one that has gone smoothly.
Yeah, I understand that.
Some specific concerns that have involved weather, that have involved equipment, and that have involved personnel.
Guarantee I'm the only chairman of the committee that's ever done an all-nighter at the base of a tower in a foot of snow while we're redoing a transmission line. And I've heard from broadcasters in my district, especially Patsy Small at KOBI, about their issue with translators. And I think a lot of us thought that would be the last thing we would deal with, and indeed it is suddenly becoming the first thing, and that the frequency tables aren't out there for the final allocations for those translators, so they may end up doing it twice. Are you running into that?
I will tell you, we have a translator in Nashville which we think may not be affected by this, but my biggest takeaway regarding translators is the difference between a primary signal and a translator is something we may all discuss, but from a viewer perspective, you get the signal or you don't.
Right.
And viewers that receive their signal via a translator value that signal as much as any other viewer. And if that's taken away, that's a tremendous disruption.
Yeah, and part of what we pledged was we would try not to diminish the coverage area of the stations. And in markets like I represent, a lot of that is served by those very translators because you're off down in a hole somewhere. So it's something we probably should have included in the funding piece and did not. And it's something we have to work through, but we also have to recognize we've got people that bought this spectrum and need to be able to move on it. So I understand that as well. We've got our work to do, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your holding this hearing.
Gentleman yells back, and at this time, Mr. Pallone, you are recognized, and I know you want me to be generous with the time because you missed your opening statement.
Oh, well, that's all right, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask unanimous consent to introduce my opening statement into the record.
So ordered.
Thank you. So this will be the second time in the last decade that the TV industry has been repacked into a smaller portion of the spectrum. The first was in 2009 with the digital television transition, and just as back then, we need to make sure that TV viewers and radio listeners do not get left behind. And so that's why I included funds in the Viewer Protection Act to help support consumer education. This was modeled on how Congress approached the DTV transition. So I wanted to start with Mr. Kaplan. You helped spearhead the consumer outreach for the FCC in 2009. In some ways, this transition seems even more complex than the last one. Are there lessons we learned from that experience that can help us this time around?
I think there is. I think the first one that many members mentioned right off the bat is industry is working together. And I'm also pleased to report that the FCC has been working very closely with our industry already to get things off the ground. And that will be critical because we all play a part, whether it's moving off spectrum, moving to spectrum. So I think collaboration is absolutely key. I think you mentioned the funding piece, and that absolutely is another important component. In the last few months of the DTV transition, Congress did approve $90 million to go towards consumer education. In that case, we had one date, June 12, 2009, that was the transition date. Here, we're gonna have many, many dates in each market to solve with. So luckily, we've at NAB done a lot already. We have a website up and running for consumers, tvanswers.org, PSAs, videos, things like that. So I think those kind of things are going to be imperative as we move forward.
Well, thank you. And then I wanted to ask Mr. Butler, during Hurricane Sandy, public broadcasters played a critical role in keeping people informed and saving lives. And I know that the stations in Houston have also been going above and beyond over the past couple of weeks. And these efforts demonstrate just how important public broadcasters are for our communities. So if you would just say, what are the potential outcomes for public TV stations if there isn't enough money in the reimbursement fund?
Well, as I've said, we operate on shoestrings to begin with, and we're nonprofit organizations that don't have a lot of capital sitting around to invest in anything. And so the risk for us is almost existential. If we have an unfunded mandate like a $50 million fund for transition that we can't meet. So everything is at risk for us. All the programming that people count on, all the educational services that we provide to schools around the country, all the public safety work that we do in New Jersey and Texas and elsewhere, and the civic leadership that we provide, trying to equip our citizens to have all the information that they need to make the appropriate decisions they need to make in the world's most important democracy. All of that's at risk if we're faced with a $50 million bill in addition to the $270 million that we're likely to get from the transition fund. If we can't pay for that, all of that is at risk, and it's a big problem for us. And I don't want to disparage anything that the commercial broadcasters feel about this too, but as nonprofits, we have a particular interest in making sure that this program is well funded.
Ms. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank our ranking member. I thank our panelists for their expert testimony here this morning. To Mr. Butler, public television is an extremely valuable resource for Americans across the country. This has been for at least a generation or more now. Public television stations are critical for the education of children and preparing them for the new STEM jobs and opportunities of the future. Unfortunately, these operations aren't always fully funded, and I'm concerned that the potential shortfall in the Repack could endanger these small stations. Would you provide us with your view as to why getting the repack right is particularly important for the nation's public television stations?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. As I've said to in other responses to other members here, the issue that we face is that we just don't have this kind of money sitting around to invest, and absent the help of Congress itself, we're going to have a very difficult time. It's going to be impossible, to be frank, for us to meet this burden, which Congress, in its original Spectrum Act, said we should not be burdened with to begin with. We should be held harmless, and this is a great harm that is about to be inflicted upon us, absent some additional funds. So I would say that the issue that we face is that all of the work that we do is endangered by the possibility that these funds will not be made available to us. And I think it's also important for the committee to understand that not only the urgency of the funds, but the fact that the funds will be made available sometime soon is just very important. Our stations, almost half of them are state or university licensees, and so they are beholden to state budget cycles, university budget processes, and so forth, and they have no capability on their own to raise this kind of money, and absent the certainty that and the speed with which Congress needs to act on this issue, half of our stations are just going to be floundering without any certainty as to how to meet this obligation. And if we go dark, all of the things that we do in education and public safety and civic leadership are gone, and the American people have been quite generous in their support for us, not only for the federal funding that we support, but in every public opinion poll that's really ever been taken since we went on the air. We are among the most trusted, the most valued institutions in America, straight across the political spectrum. And I just don't think we want to lose that at a time like this.
Let me finish with the public broadcasting folks who it's a great heritage, a great tradition, an example, and I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about the Luther movie that's going to be aired in many public broadcasting stations on September 12th. This is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, so Thrivent Financial has put together a movie to talk about the life and times of Martin Luther, and it'll be aired nationally. That's something that obviously the for-profit entities can't do all the time. It's an education historical account, and that's that added value that you all bring. And so we would hope in this transition that we first do no harm to other voices out there in the broadcast sector. Mr. Butler, you want to comment or add to that?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. The Luther documentary is a wonderful example of the kind of work that we do that nobody else does. I'm not on the programming end of the public television business, so I don't want to misrepresent anything here, but it is true that this is our stock in trade, going to programming that nobody else is going to do. In that vein, Ken Burns will be premiering his 18-hour history of the Vietnam War starting on September the 17th on public television. There's nobody else in the world that would devote 18 hours to a history of the Vietnam War other than American public television, and we're very proud of the fact that that's the business that we're in. Whatever one thinks one knows about the Vietnam War, your assumptions are going to be challenged, and some will be overturned by this series that Ken has done. I've been fortunate to see all 18 hours of it, and it's a masterpiece. So we're very proud of the fact that we do that kind of programming, which is not going to find its way on any other broadcast signal, and we are committed to continuing that kind of work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yells back, Mr. Welch, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to thank the panel. It's been a really good panel. Bottom line here, we want to make sure the broadcasters have a good signal, and we want to get the benefit of deployment of broadband in rural areas. That's a really, really important issue for rural America, which is most of America. Mr. Kaplan, I support Ranking Member Pallone's bill to provide additional funds so that the broadcasters they're held harmless during the Repack process. But I'd ask you, you've done this a bit already, but can you elaborate on what the broadcasters need to ensure the smoothest Repack possible and to ensure that viewers are not left in the dark for any period of time after the Repack?
Sure, we need two things, which is money and time. And in terms of money, it's to be fully reimbursed because broadcasters, as I said, today are spending that money. They're putting in the orders, they need to do it. We've heard testimony about exactly the steps that are necessary to do these tower climbs, to have the antennas, transmitters, those types of things are critical.
So Mr. Doyle asked everybody whether there is enough money, and everybody with one abstention said there isn't. What are we talking about in terms of money? And can you explain how you have come to a conclusion about what's needed?
Sure. Well, in terms of, we could look to the FCC. So we've all submitted, broadcasters have submitted initial estimates that the FCC has looked through, and that came to over $2.1 billion. Also, we've heard today from members issues about radio, low-power television, and those things are enormously important for the ecosystem as well. So, you know, we're in the neighborhood. We know it's going to be at least $2.1 billion, and it's probably going to go up a little bit, plus money for some other entities that are casualties in the process.
Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Flores, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the panelists. It's been a great hearing so far. Unfortunately, there were some unintended consequences in the repacking. Mr. Bill Rockus addressed one of those with the low-power TV and translators. Another one is that the industry, the broadcast industry, shares towers with AM stations, FM stations, and also with FM translators. And so those operators are also going to be impacted as the broadcaster, the TV broadcasters go through the repacking process and changing transmitters and antennas and so forth. So to address this issue, yesterday Mr. Green and I introduced H.R. 3685, the Radio Consumer Protection Act. This bill establishes a similar fund for the narrow purpose of reimbursing radio stations during the repacking transition. It closes the unintended oversight that prevents radio stations from being left out of the process. And we've all seen the vital role that local radio stations play for millions of Americans that are faced with severe weather, such as Harvey and Irma, and natural disasters and other local emergencies. And it's at times like these that local radio can be a lifeline for the people we serve, especially when power and all other communications services are down. So my questions are these. Mr. Kaplan, do you have an idea as to how many towers that the TV broadcast industry used are shared with AM, FM, and FM translators?
I do, and first of all, thank you and Congressman Green for introducing that bill. It's a very important legislation. There are actually 678 TV towers that would share with FM stations.
Okay, and so my next question is what's the impact on those radio stations as the TV stations start to do their modifications?
It could have a significant impact on those stations because what happens is when tower climbers go up to do the adjustments they need for the TV repack, the FM stations have to power down, for safety reasons. And it all depends upon when those happen. During the DTV transition, it was less of a problem because we had far more time. So radio stations could organize that, 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., and that was not a big deal. Mm-hmm. But with a tight timeline they're under now, unless they build auxiliary stations, they're going to be forced to, power down during drive time or for weeks at a time.
Well, your last comment there says leads me to ask the question: are there any other unforeseen costs of the spectrum repacking on the radio industry that were not envisioned originally?
Not at this time, but as days go by and things happen, we keep learning new things, which is why processes like these can be very difficult.
Okay. I'd ask you to supplementally advise the committee as those come up, if you would. Thank you all for your responses, and I've exhausted my time. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Mr. Costello.
Thank you. I read all of the testimony and looked over a bunch of various questions I was going to ask, and I think for the most part we've touched on everything. That's the blessing and the curse of being last, sitting at the end of the chair. I wanted to get a couple things on the record, though, that I think are relevant for a couple different reasons. Let me just start as co-chair of the Public Broadcasting Caucus, Mr. Butler, just to give you an opportunity to explain how this repacking may be a bit different for the public broadcasting vis-a-vis others.
Yes, sir. Thank you, and thanks, first of all, for being the co-chair of our Public Broadcasting Caucus. We're honored to have you in that leadership position. As has been said, and as Mr. Bergman was just touching on, this is not really a 39-month transition for lots of our stations. This is a much shorter transition than that. 14 of our public television stations have to make this transition within the next year, almost November 30th of 2018. And then there's a cascading effect. The next phase begins the next day, and so the last phase, which will take us up to July of 2020, we only have 14 stations left at that point to get repacked, and so 135 of our stations alone are going to have to repack well before that 39-month
Why is that?
deadline, because of the phasing in that the FCC has created for this process. And so I'm sorry, Congresswoman Eshoo is not here for me to be able to clarify that. 39 months is a long time, but a year is not a long time, and this is a cascading effect that's going to have a very serious effect on public broadcasters in particular, because of the difficulty we have in attracting capital for such purposes.
Thank you. Mr. Kaplan, in your written testimony, I want to read a paragraph, a couple sentences, give you an opportunity to respond, and any others to just unwind this a little bit, both from my understanding technically, which I think I know the answer to, as well as what some of the unforeseen implications may be and how they may have to be addressed, be it through the waiver process or otherwise. The repack must take into account the costs and need for coordination associated with TV and radio stations which themselves were not repacked, but which, due to their proximity to repacked TV stations, must produce power or transmit from an alternate facility for some period of time. These stations' viewers and listeners should not be dismissed as collateral damage solely because the FCC's original repacking plan did not take them into consideration. Why, due to their proximity to repacked TV stations, must they reduce power or transmit? I think we know the answer to that, but if you could put that on the record. And then secondly, can you discuss some of this collateral damage and how we may need to go about addressing it or be sensitive to it?
Great, thank you for the question. And I think this gets back to Congressman Flores' question earlier, which is that radio stations that share, and we have almost 700, that share towers with repacked TV stations aren't just going to continue to operate business as usual. When those changes are made to the towers, the FM radio stations will have to power down, go off the air. If they don't have an auxiliary facility to accommodate that, they are literally going to be off the air. You'll get static. You won't hear your radio station. So, and that's for safety reasons, RF safety reasons. So that's critical that's addressed, and it can be done in two ways. Money is critical because if you have the ability to build an auxiliary station, then that can solve some of the problem. And time and flexibility. You said at the end of your remarks, I think that was exactly right, which is to be sensitive to. I think the issue to be sensitive to is the rushed transition, which we're all going to try and meet each and every deadline, does put pressure on those kind of situations, because whereas you could power down at night during the DTV transition, because that's when the work can be done, we don't have that luxury if we're going to meet each of the 10 phases.
Right. Mr. Butler, the APTS partnership with the wireless industry to conduct a pilot project on spectrum sharing, just share your thoughts on how it was successful, how it may help your members, as well as any learning lessons.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Among the most important lessons that we learned was the fact that we do have a substantial channel capacity, even in a channel sharing arrangements so that both a public station, for example, and a commercial station could run a full complement of channels that they wish to run simultaneously. We also learned that the dynamic nature of this sharing is very important and conducive to a successful channel sharing arrangement. I had gotten, as a non-technologist, I had gone in thinking, well, we get 50% of the spectrum and you get 50%.
Right.
The fact is that it's dynamically shared, and whoever needs more at one
Shift
given
back,
time
right.
can have it. And so our pilot program in Southern California proved what kind of equipment we need.
Maybe more agility in there than one.
Exactly right. Yes, sir. So that was very important, and we're very much indebted to our friends at CTIA for helping us to do that.
Very good. Thank you. My time has expired. I appreciate all of your testimony. Yield back.
Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions for the panel, I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Before we conclude, I ask unanimous consent to enter the following letters into the record. A letter from Electronics Research Incorporated, a letter from the LPTV Spectrum Rights Coalition, a T-Mobile press release from Ms. Murray Thompson, and an op-ed offered by Mr. Long. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that witnesses submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. Seeing no further business before the subcommittee today, without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.